today's talk from Declan McDowell-Naylor will be on Beyond the MSM, Mainstream Media, Understanding the Rise of Online Alternative Political Media. And he's going to draw on some of the findings from this major project, 3-year project funded by the ESRC. So, Declan, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for taking time this afternoon to come to this talk, and thank you to the guys at MeCCSA for inviting us. Very, very happy to be presenting this today. I was at Tom's talk last month and there was a very rich range of questions and discussion. So hoping we can get some great feedback and discussion points today on our research. So just to introduce myself, I'm Declan McDowell-Naylor. I'm a research associate at Cardiff University at JMEC, working on this project with Stephen Cushion and Richard Thomas from Swansea. Basically looking at, as we said in the introduction, what we're calling online alternative political media and their emergence in the British media system the last few years. So this project is ESRC funded from 2019 till the middle of next year, 2022. The overall scope of the project is fundamentally about understanding the content, the production and the consumption of online alternative political media. So I'm going to explain what we mean by this term online alternative political media in a moment, but just to kind of give you an outline of the project itself. Content production and consumption, they're the 3 kind of pillars that make up our research project. So we are conducting content analysis of articles from between 2015 and this year. We've done this in batches, so what I'm going to present today is from 2015 to 2018. Production, where we interview the editors and contributors of these sites. That phase has literally just finished. I've interviewed over 40 individuals now from various different sites, which I'm going to show you in a second. And consumption, this is the phase that we're working on right now, where we speak to audiences of this content. We are conducting a large survey, which we're trying to launch today, coincidentally, to discover and find users of alternative online political media. As well as in-depth interviews with a batch of the heavier users of this content as well. We've conducted about 20 of those so far based on one method of contacting people, and hopefully we're going to be able to draw some out of the survey as well. So what are we looking at? These are just a few of the sites that we began with. So from the top, if you're not familiar with these, we have the Squawk Box, we have Westmonster, which is now defunct, has become a personality-based YouTube channel led by an individual called Michael Heaver, who was Nigel Farage's communications guy, for lack of a better term there. Conservative Woman, a kind of small conservative blog. The Canary, which some of you may well have heard of Our Politics, similarly. Another Angry Voice. Novara Media, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. Breitbart, their London news desk, and Guido Fawkes as well. So the selection kind of criteria here at the start of the project was based around the 2017 general election, where this is kind of where the rationale of the project comes from, where there was a kind of a recognition that a lot of these outlets had become either prominent or more prominent as a result of the kind of political events surrounding the 2017 general election. So there is no real established typology, and this is something that we deal with in a paper that we're working on right now. There's no real established typology for these websites, in the same way that we can say the Times, the Guardian, they are broadsheets, or the BBC, Sky, they are broadcasters. With these outlets, there's no such kind of routine or standardized way of looking at them. So we kind of went in blind in many ways when we were trying to pick our sample, and worked on an inductive basis to basically, as we said at the beginning there, with the aim of the project being about understanding. So a lot of the findings kind of stem from that basic uncertainty at the start of the project. As the course of the project went on, we obviously encountered more outlets, and this is just a snapshot of some of those outlets that we've encountered. So we have on the left here Unity News Network, which is a right-wing outlet. The London Economic, which is kind of becoming more prominent, has people like Gavin Esler writing for it. Gavin Esler, who used to work for the BBC, present Newsnight. The smaller independents like Dorset Eye, Manchester Meteor, some more specialist outlets like Declassified UK, which kind of works on exposing arms trade deals and things like that in the UK. And then Byline Times, which has become a lot more prominent lately, which is led by Peter Jukes, who was obviously very prominent around the phone hacking scandal, the guy who live tweeted all of that stuff, and also has Peter Oborne doing a monthly column for it as well. So some of these have become more prominent and some of these have become less prominent, as I suggested in my comments. I'm going to start with a bit of conceptual housekeeping. So when we talk about alternative media, when we use the term alternative, what do we mean? In interviews, this has come up quite often as a kind of contentious term, but just to pin it down in an academic, theoretical sense, when we talk about alternative media, we mean what Holt and colleagues call a self-perceived corrective of traditional, legacy, or mainstream news media in any given social, cultural, or historical context. So by this, what this means is that the term alternative is a definition that is heavily dependent on the national context and the media system. The UK's media system, like many others, like all others, is always undergoing changes. For example, and this is what the image here illustrates, changes to the lobby briefing system, which is since I think the news broke last night and today that the Allegra Stratton's press conference things have been scrapped. She's moved on to a different thing, and now this is just a sort of all-purpose briefing room, and so the original plan is gone. But this just illustrates really the kind of rapid changes that can occur in the UK's media system. I'm just going to touch on this diagram, which again comes from Holt and colleagues' work. This is a kind of conceptual framework within which we've been working, which is a kind of relational multi-level, as they call it, where we understand alternative media, alternative online political media, not necessarily from any normative perspective, but how they relate to the mainstream media within any given context. Okay, so and similarly, in the sense that we didn't have an established typology of these outlets, it didn't make any sense to take a normative framework of journalism, politics, media, and apply it to something that we weren't necessarily sure what we were dealing with. So we've taken a relational perspective here, where we understand content in terms of how it relates to the mainstream, or we look at their organizational features and see how they relate to the mainstream too. And the idea behind this is that we don't dichotomize alternative and mainstream. What we actually try to understand is that there are components of the outlets we're looking at which may resemble mainstream media, and vice versa. Mainstream media may have components that resemble those found in so-called alternative media outlets, and also it allows internal distinctions between different alternative media outlets as well. I'll just use the term alternative media as a shorthand here for the sake of time and simplicity, but being aware that we're sticking within the kind of conceptual parameters I'm trying to lay out here. So, for example, we may look at features of Novara Media, a outlet which is increasingly becoming more professionalised, and say that there are elements of that which more closely resemble a mainstream media outlet. And then we may look at an outlet like the Squawk Box, which is run by a single individual, which doesn't necessarily have all these professionalised features. For example, Novara Media actually have a studio. And we'll be able to draw distinctions between Novara Media and the Squawk Box based on how they actually relate to the mainstream, if that makes sense. So this just really avoids homogenizing alternative media, as has often happened in a lot of the commentary which we collected at the start of the project, which dealt with this. So this is kind of the basis of our conceptual thinking around alternative media and how we are understanding and approaching them. And as much as we're trying to draw comparisons between them, we're also trying to understand what's distinct about them too. And an interesting thing to draw on here is, for example, the fact that Peter Oborne writes for Byline Times. Byline Times, which could be considered an independent alternative media outlet, has a famously very mainstream, what was probably previously considered a very mainstream journalist in Peter Oborne, now writing for them. So there's a very dynamic environment as well to take into account. Some basic kind of overview stats. This is drawn from the latest Reuters report, digital news report, just showing the kind of prominence of alternative media within the broader media system. We are ourselves looking into these figures, these lower figures, to kind of come up with our own evidence. But even if these figures were way off, they would still show that the alternative media outlets have a smaller share of the media environment in the UK. Although that's not necessarily to say that they have no power, as we're going to, or relevance, as we're going to explore in this talk. Another really important kind of context here is this element, this aspect of trust in the mainstream media. So Nick Robinson in 2017 gave these comments about alternative media, in which he claimed that they were partisan, connected to a kind of guerrilla war being fought on social media against the mainstream media. And he laid the lack of trust in mainstream media as he saw it at the feet of various media outlets. And he name-checked Navarra, he name-checked the Canary, he name-checked the Squawk Box. This quote is one I put to every single one of the interview participants to kind of get a response to how they see the mainstream media. But this is just a nice bit of important context, which everyone who I've been interviewing and who's kind of involved in alternative media tends to be aware of. And what it really points to is this persistent antagonism that occurs between mainstream and alternative media. Again, just to kind of give a bit of context to that comment, again from the Reuters Digital News Report, BBC remains the most trusted news source in the UK according to their data, and you can compare that down there with the tabloids like The Sun as well. I'm giving you any longitudinal data here because I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, and I don't want to spend too long, but this is just to give a bit of context. Okay, so on to some of the findings now. I've laid out a bit of the background for the project. Forgive me for that background, but it's quite a lot to kind of deal with at the very start of the project. So our content analysis, so far we've conducted content analysis that ranges from the year 2015 to 2018, and we'll be looking into this year doing content analysis from 2019 onwards. We looked at article content and that's what I'm going to focus on here. We looked at sources. Today I was actually looking at this data. We have about 16,000 individual sources, which we drew from the pool of articles and currently analysing those. I can ask questions about that, but I'm not presenting anything here as we're kind of still chewing through it. And also we looked at around 13,000 tweets, I think, from the main outlet accounts and analysed those for their content too. What I'm going to go through here is the content, the analysis of the articles content that we looked at for these years. So this is our sample size and distribution, and along the bottom there you can see the hyperlinks where we drew this from and the sample periods that we selected. So you can see that we included the entire 2017 general election. The sample sizes obviously vary because what we did was we took the complete range of articles that appeared in the sample selection periods to gauge the output of these articles. That was one of the things we were really interested in from an organisational perspective, their kind of capacity to produce content and then to contextualise our content analysis within that. When we come to doing the 2019 to 2021 analysis, what we're going to do is take a theory-driven approach and have similar size samples so that we can take a slightly different perspective here. But as I said, because very little was known about alternative media in the UK, we took this approach as kind of from an inductive ground-up basis to just find out as much as we could effectively. Unfortunately, we weren't able to do video audio content because of the time constraints that introduces into an analysis. This primarily affected our Navarra Media sample, which is a very heavily video and audio content based outlet. So the findings about Navarra Media we take with a very, very, almost a handful of salt really, because of the difference that you can see there in terms of its sample size. Although there are some interesting things I think we can talk about with them. Okay, so firstly, one of the things we looked at was what we call fact-driven or opinion-driven content. And this is basically where we coded articles based on whether we felt that they're led and continued with a fact-driven piece of content where they were kind of reporting what was happening, or whether they led with an opinion-driven range of content where they introduced an opinion and kind of stuck to that. So broadly analogous to the distinction between reporting and commentary, which is also embedded in press guidelines, coincidentally, and also thankfully because we've been trying to look at those two, because a lot of these outlets are regulated by Impress. And Impress actually ask that fact and opinion are clearly distinguished. So this was quite a useful variable for us. As you can see here, looking at 2015 to 2018 inclusively, this is how a lot of them broke down. The general finding here is that right-wing alternative media tend to produce more fact-driven content, and that left-wing outlets tend to produce more opinion-driven content. But the caveats here are that longitudinally, a lot of the left-wing outlets have been moving increasingly towards fact-driven content, and there are reasons for that, we think. And that during the election, there was a huge spike in left-wing commentary, which is what drove up some of the percentages here for opinion-based content. So, for example, in the Canary, where it says 26% fact-driven content, outside of the election, you actually see that number closer to about 50%. So if I was going to show you the longitudinal graphs, you could see that. And so here we have the topics of coverage. Generally speaking, what we found was that from a plurality point of view, party political content was overwhelmingly favoured by most outlets, especially left-wing outlets, and this is where they would cover things like what's going on in the Labour Party or what's going on in the Conservatives and so on. The second largest category for a number of these outlets was media coverage, where they would talk about the media, and then the third largest, when you kind of put them all together, was EU affairs. Although you'll notice that right-wing outlets such as Conservative Women, Breitbart, Guido, they tended to focus much more on EU affairs than left-wing outlets. And our interview findings actually suggest there was a reason for that, which was that left-wing outlets routinely avoided Brexit as a topic because it was too difficult an issue for the Labour Party and therefore a lot of their readership. So it was an issue that they actually purposely avoided, interestingly. Now, this is going to kind of feed into what I'm going to summarise about some of these outlets here. Okay, so and all other, we had about 18 categories overall. So that grey segment you can see there is made up of about 15 different categories. So a lot of those are about 4 or 5%. Right-wing outlets focused a lot more on social affairs and immigration as well. If we were going to include those, you'd see that I think immigration was about 10% for something like Breitbart, again, which I'm going to kind of talk about in a moment. This is a table which shows what percentage of articles focused on a particular political party. Okay, so for the Canary, for example, you can see that a large proportion of their articles were about the Conservatives, and you can see, for example, that for Squawk it was roughly equal, similar for Guido as well, and none as well, of course. So you can see here that just like I said, party politics is a huge focus for a lot of these outlets. The grey bits are where they don't focus on party politics. So most of these outlets are predominantly writing about party politics most of the time, is the finding here. And also that for the vast majority of that time, they are focusing on two main political parties, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. Most of the time, the Liberal Democrats, for example, are completely ignored. I think Guido Fawkes actually gives the most coverage to the Liberal Democrats. Now, this is this variable here was about whether they were critical or just critical of a political party. So our variable here was whether in their focus on political parties, were they supportive, were they neutral, or were they critical? Overwhelmingly, you see that left-wing alternative media sites were critical of the Conservative Party when they covered them. Whereas some of the right-wing outlets, you can see that there's a bit more of a split between whether they're critical of the Conservative or the Labour Party. I'm going to kind of summarise this in a moment and explain why we think this is. But as you can see here, there's a strong tendency towards being critical. If you flip this around and demonstrate the supportive chart, you see the inverse. So you see that if we're looking at the percentage of articles that are supportive of the political party, the Canary, it flips around. So the bar becomes red for their overwhelming support for the Labour Party, for example. Okay, so just kind of round up some of these things. This is some of the ideas that we're working with at the moment for a suggested typology. Thanks to our reviewers for this paper, we kind of came to the conclusion that we should come up with a typology, given the fact that we've worked through an inductive basis. So some of the suggested ideas that we've come up with so far are what we call electoral hyperpartisans, which is outlets which orientate themselves around a political party with the intention of getting that political party elected, or not necessarily a political party, but a faction within a political party. So it might be like an internal election. The thing to say about this typology is that it was constructed in using our relational method of thinking, so in relation to mainstream media. So actually, mainstream media outlets could also be included in this typology. So you might think of a tabloid, for example, during an election could very easily be an electoral hyper-partisan. Thinking of the Loughborough research from the last couple of years, where they looked at the percentage of negative and supportive stories. Although one important distinction we make there is that tabloids tend to be critical of everyone during an election, whereas what we find with our alternative media outlets is that they are critical of one particular party and very supportive of another political party, which we don't actually see if you look at Loughborough's findings, for example. So that's one kind of type that we've established or suggest. Another is issue partisans. We think this mainly applies to outlets like Breitbart or Westminster, where they orientate themselves around a particular issue such as Brexit, and then shape their coverage around that. So they'll present a one-sided representation of a particular issue. So they're very partisan about that issue. So they would only present information which shows Brexit in a good light, and they would only show information which shows the opponents of that issue in a bad light. So that's another type that we've suggested. Another is political cycle specialists, which is, if you think of the political information cycle as being a kind of daily routine of trying to get in there and set the agenda, there are a number of these outlets specialising in doing that effectively. So the Squawk Box is very interesting because most of its content is about the Labour Party, has lots of sources and connections within the Labour Party, and at times in a political cycle, if it has a good scoop, can enter into the political information cycle and set the agenda around a certain issue. I think in the 2017 election, we definitely saw this a lot, where outlets were able to grasp something, set the agenda, and push an issue. Guido Fawkes is, we would say, is the archetypal political cycle specialist, where it's able to get a particular scoop and push that into the political information cycle and affect politics on a daily or weekly basis. But again, some outlets cross over into these different types at different times. And then finally, we have what we call vernacular macro blogs, which are things like Another Angry Voice. These would be they're not just blogs in the kind of sense of like, here's my blog and I've written about something. They're macro blogs, so they have a social media following, they have a large platform in which to speak to, but they're not news or media professionalized organizations. They tend to be one person with a kind of persona who's coming from a particular point of view. So Another Angry Voice is very much about the kind of Yorkshireman persona of Thomas G. Clarke and how he presents himself. Another Angry Voice also has 300,000 Facebook followers, which is not insubstantial. So this is a kind of what we think is of another type, and we see some other outlets which may resemble that. Originally, Guido Fawkes we could consider as a vernacular macro blog. It actually describes itself on its website as a news site with a blog heritage. So you can think of there's certain elements there which would resemble that too. So we're kind of hoping to get this typology improved. I don't necessarily think perfected based on our data, but it's certainly something that we can test in a theory-driven content analysis going forward if the reviewers like it, basically. Okay, I'm conscious of running out of time here, so I'm just going to skim through this bit here because there's a paper already produced which you can look at, which does this in much more detail. But basically, one of the things we looked at was media critique. So how did these outlets critique the media in their content? You can see here that most of the time they don't offer critique, but they still offer, a lot of the time, they have something in their content which is critiquing the mainstream media. So a third of the Canaries articles, for example, and around a third of the Squawk Boxes articles contain a critique of the mainstream media, even if it's just a small segment of that article. So that's quite a consistent strategy, if you like, in terms of their content. Overwhelmingly, when we looked at these instances of critique, we find that they were overtly critical, with small segments of praise. And when we broke down the apologies if these are slightly difficult to look at, I'm happy to explain them in detail in the questions. But the key finding here is that most of the time what we find is that impartiality or bias on account of the mainstream media is one of the things, is the key thing that's been criticised. And again, what we found was that and this is the key finding from the paper I'll tell you about at the end of this talk, is that we find that the BBC was the main source of critique. So often times when a media outlet was criticised, it was the BBC, and this would link to Tom's talk last month. here when we're thinking about the future of the BBC. And one of the questions in our paper was, is this having an impact on the perception of the BBC if this has a wide readership and so on? There's lots of questions here which can be raised. But the pattern again is that impartiality is a kind of key critique aimed at that. I'm going to finish off here with by kind of indicating the research interviews that we've done and to give you some choice quotes. Just so, and in this point particularly, I would invite questions because a lot of these interviews, I did them all, done about 40. The information is in transcripts, but it's also in my head. So if you want to ask questions more broadly about alternative media, then please do, because I can answer them on the basis of my experience with these interviews. So this is a quote from someone at Bavarian Media, and they talk about, this is a theme as well in the interviews that's emerged, models of journalism. So here we hear them talking about how their journalism is committed politically, but they also still adhere to a number of normative ideas about what objective journalism is, right? So the idea of like truth, for example, but still being able to do that from a particular political perspective, i.e. a socialist. Fact and opinion has come from the Squawk Box, and they talk about here how they differentiate between fact and opinion in their content. So, you know, talking about how they try to make it clear that oftentimes there's a very kind of blurred line about what's fact and opinion, at least in their view. So he said there's not necessarily a hard line between opinion and fact, in the sense that two people looking at the same circumstances may come to different conclusions and so on. And this again was a very consistent pattern in our findings. First principles and rationales for why they kind of set up their outlets, because a lot of these outlets are very new, it's very fresh in their head. This again was something that came about. This is from Evolved Politics, and here they talk about a kind of anti-capitalist sense of where they came from in terms of how they wanted to set up their media outlet. And then the question of hyperpartisanship and also self-definition is a really crucial key part of the interview findings here. We often ask them, you know, how do you define yourself? If we talk to you, if we call you alternative media, well, how does that make you feel? Like, what does that bring out? Or do you prefer to be called something else? How do you define what you are? And also, this often brings up questions of partisanship, because they're all very aware of the term hyperpartisan and how it's been kind of laid at their door a lot of the time. This is someone from the Canary, talking about how they prefer to be called independent, and as independent from like established media and the pitfalls of established media. And then finally, as I said at the start, we're conducting an audience survey and some audience interviews again. Like I said, I've done 20 interviews with audience members, and the survey is hopefully going out soon. And again, would love to hear any questions that relate to this as well, but I won't go into this in too much detail. And then finally, if you're interested in the media critique findings, which I talked about there, then of course there's a paper in Journalism Studies published last month, which you can go and look at. We also currently have a paper in the revise and resubmit stage, which is where we talk about that typology that I mentioned too, and go through the findings supporting that. Okay, so that's all of the findings so far, is in a kind of brief and succinct way as possible. Really do invite questions around this topic. There's so much to talk about, so really interested to hear your thoughts about all of that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Declan. That was excellent. Really, really great presentation. And you got some fantastic data, I have to say. I mean, really impressive. Like, even the interview data alone would make for a own project, and you've got so much more you can bring to it. So thank you ever so much for that. I'll pass over to our audience. If you want to use the chat box, if you're unable to use your mic, or you could use your microphone and your camera, that would be great. So over to you. Thank you. Rosalind, if you want to go ahead.
Hi Declan, thank you for that. That was super interesting. I was really interested in that last comment from the interview, the hyperpartisan comment. I was just wondering if that's something that kind of came out of the interviews, this idea that, you know, whether they call themselves a news site or a blog, or whether they're left or right wing, that they kind of see themselves as I guess kicking back against the mainstream media and against these kind of, you know, whatever billionaire funded kind of traditional media conglomerates, I guess. Is that a kind of central thread through these sort of outlets?
Yes, it's I would say probably it's fundamentally central. In fact, it might even be the most fundamental component of their entire reason for existing. So you can see this in many ways. You can see it on their sites. They often have their self-descriptions and their about pages will always talk about themselves in relation to the mainstream media as a kind of reason for their even existing in the first place as alternative outlets. And this links into the conceptual side, where we take that kind of self-perceived corrective definition, and we use that self-perceived correction definition because we think it's fundamentally accurate in an empirical sense. And then in the content, you see it because they're often very critical of the mainstream media. And that's, again, part of their kind of reasoning and rationale for existing. It's also very popular with their audiences, so it feeds in again. And yes, and in the interviews, it's incredibly consistent in terms of how they see themselves. They are very aware of how they kind of sit in relation to the mainstream media. They oftentimes take a lot of a kind of encouragement and inspiration by being criticised by the mainstream media. So when I give them the Nick Robinson quote, they're kind of delighted because they're like, "Oh, you said that about us. That's great," because that's kind of we like that. It gives us attention. There was a really interesting example a couple of weeks ago where Byline Times, you probably saw this. They wrote a story about Home Office and expenses, and they didn't make any claims in it, but it went very popular. It went popular on Twitter about Priti Patel's eyebrows, and then a couple of mainstream media journalists, I think one from the Mirror, was very critical of Byline Times, saying, you should check your stories and stuff. But when I spoke to the guys at Byline Times, they said this was fantastic. We got so many hits, we got so many new subscribers off the back of this like hype and criticism from the mainstream media that we really enjoyed it. And so yeah, I mean, there's a lot of components there, but as you've asked, it's incredibly central to what they do and how they are.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks, Rosalind. Any other questions? Use the chat box, and obviously you raise your hand if you want to, and then use your microphone if you're able to.
Could I come in? Hi, Declan. It's Emily Harmer.
Hiya.
Thanks so much for your talk. You've got so much data and so much stuff going on there. Like, I'm really looking forward to seeing it all come out. I just wanted to ask basically just give you a chance to talk a bit about the audience interviews, really, because I'm kind of interested to see, kind of going off the back of what Ros just asked you, is that a really central component to how the audience see themselves as kind of, and how do they continue to sort of consume mainstream stuff as well as kind of enjoying their kind of hyper partisans?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. So one of the things we're trying to do in the survey is compare alternative media use and their kind of view of it with mainstream media use and their view of it too. Because in the interviews that I've done, there's a kind of mixed bag of people, really big jumble of people. Some of them don't use mainstream media at all. They're completely switched off from it and will only consume alternative media. Some use a blend of both, or they might have particular alternative media that they like, but still kind of use the BBC a lot. So I think if you wanted to think again about typologies, it would produce a tremendously wide variety of different people in terms of how they engage with this content. So it's useful in a way because I think the audience for alternative media has been heavily stigmatized in commentary. As I know, for something like The Canary, it's very much just Corbynistas, right? That was the kind of commentary refrain that was used a lot. But from the interviews I've done, I think you'd find there's quite a wide variety of people. Certainly people are still using mainstream media, but they might use it in a negative way, which is one of the things that we're trying to explore in the survey. So we're asking, if you do use mainstream media, do you feel satisfied with your use of the mainstream media? Or are you using the BBC, for example, as a kind of reflection that you can use to sort of support and justify what's being said in the alternative media? So are basically audiences triangulating what alternative media is saying about the mainstream media by using mainstream media and putting all of it together? I don't think we'll necessarily get entirely to the bottom of it because it also relates to such much bigger, broader questions about what's happening in the media system and how people feel and where they are in terms of their disenfranchisement with the mainstream media. But hopefully we can get into some of those questions in a more general sense, because alternative media aren't going to last forever, and certainly not all of these sites are going to outlast the economic conditions. But in terms of the lasting relevance of these sites for audiences, it's very important because it tells us a lot about the media system. If we can understand why audiences are turning away from the mainstream media, which are supposed to fulfil these normative functions in a democracy, towards other alternatives which have perhaps different normative functions, or even in some cases when the interviews actually have very similar normative functions. Talking to someone from Novara, and they were talking about the sense that, you know, they like the BBC and they like what the BBC does in theory, and they try to emulate a lot of those things. Sorry, I think I picked up about 6 different tangents there. Did I answer the kind of central thing you asked, or do you want me to go back over it?
Yeah, no, it's great. I just wanted to get a sense of how people see it, because I was just sort of thinking of people who consume stuff like Novara are, I just wondered whether they kind of are real news junkies. Like, do they kind of really engage with everything so you can be kind of super critical? But yeah, no, thanks. That's great. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. I just wanted to follow up on that. Declan shares privilege, so I can always sort of crowbar in a question at any time. But I mean, is there a sense that online platforms, I'm thinking about algorithms and visibility of alternative platforms versus, you know, mainstream media ones? I think Emily's point about sort of hate binging certain media platforms, I think we all probably are guilty of that at times. Is that something which is at play here, which might explain why you may have people who are frequenting, for example, Novara Media, but also looking at things like the Mail, which comes into their Facebook timeline or their social media one from a relative, maybe about Brexit? Is there an element where social media is perhaps directing people in what can seem like quite contradictory directions, and that their media consumption might reflect that?
I would find it hard to say, because we haven't necessarily, or just on the social media point, because we haven't measured that in any way. We have some reach data, but we need to really kind of refine it. But it don't necessarily tell us about the algorithms. What I can tell you about that is that the sense of the algorithms from the editors and the contributors is very clear, and they feel that their traffic was kind of stolen from them by Facebook in about 2018 by a shift in the way that Facebook's algorithm works. So they obviously, or it seems clear that they rode a wave of algorithms in the lead up to 2018, especially around the election, where they were able to kind of game the Facebook algorithm in a certain way, or not necessarily game, but just use it as it was to gain huge audiences, right, and get a lot of attention. And then something happened in 2018, and every single person brings this up unprompted in their interviews, and they say that whatever happened meant our traffic kind of just plateaued, right? So the people that we have, they've stayed, and we've burned our kind of audience reach is gradually kind of increasing, and it's very hard for new alternatives to break in because of that, because they're so dependent on social media. They don't have any other infrastructure to use. They don't have TV or radio or anything like that. In terms of crossover, was that the question? So in terms of like crossover between, say, like a Daily Mail and a Novara Media reader because of algorithms, is that the kind of? Yeah,
just in terms of somebody seeing that or encountering it.
So I don't know is the answer to that. In terms of algorithms, I do know that there are some interesting crossover in terms of how people use different sources of mainstream and alternative media. They would probably say, based on the limited evidence that we have so far from the interviews, that and the survey will probably give us a much clearer idea of this, because we asked, for example, do you use alternative media, and also do you use tabloids? That I would expect there might be some crossover between, say, like the Canary and the Mail, because the Daily Mirror, because there's a kind of tabloid connection, and I think there's a strong crossover between using a daily, like a right-wing tabloid, and using something like Guido, because there are very clear synergies between those outlets, right? Like Harry Cole is now the editor of The Sun and was previously at Guido, so there's like clear synergies connections between those types of outlets. I think it does kind of bifurcate across left and right, so that you're more likely to find someone reading The Guardian, but also reading Novara. Although one of the really interesting things that came up in quite a few of the audience interviews was the way they said, I'm just fed up with The Guardian because it pretends to be something it's not, and that's why I now read Novara, or why I read the Canary. And also when I've done interviews with, say, people from Novara, they actually use something like the New Statesman as a benchmark of something that they'd like to kind of knock off and overtake. So they're going to get an idea of where they think their readership is coming from. A lot of the left-wing outlets, I think it's kind of disenfranchised Guardian readers tend to be, for Novara, I think, seems to be quite an interesting crossover. And I think a lot of people are just kind of, again, this is more anecdotal from having not looked through the audience study properly, the audience interviews properly, but there does seem to be a sense that people are kind of captive to the BBC because it's so dominant, but they're not very happy about it, so they supplement it through the use of alternative media. That would be my answer to those questions. But sorry, unfortunately, I can't answer directly answer the algorithmic one because we just don't have any evidence to draw on there.
I think you answered it very clearly. And again, it's interesting, again, perhaps the BBC thing's explained by the fact that the license fee, many people who maybe don't have an awful lot of time for it probably think they should get their value for money out of it. And that probably might reflect that too. But thanks, Declan. Any other questions? Maria,
I have a question. Okay, thanks. Hi, Declan. Thank you very much. This was fascinating. My question is about the last part of the research, consumption, which is still work in progress, as you explained. And I have some questions around methods.
Yep, fantastic.
How did you find the audience? How easy it was to access members of the audience? Can you tell us a bit about your thinking? How did you select some members to interview? Because you said you've done some interviews already. Do you expect to have the same number of respondents from the different outlets you have examined? And then finally, you mentioned a survey. So if you can tell us a bit about how you plan to distribute the survey.
Yeah. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Really great questions. So, okay, so the audience study is split into the two phases. We have the survey and the interviews. The original plan was to just do the interviews, but COVID kind of messed that up a little. So we managed to get some extra funding to do the survey, and the two have now become interconnected. So in terms of finding the audiences, the original plan was to do a mixture of, again, analogous to the fact this is very inductive, we didn't really know what we were dealing with. The original plan was to use lots of different methods to kind of locate audiences. The one that we ended up using because of the pandemic was social media, effectively. So there were two strategies here. The first in social media was to find people who'd post hyperlinks to content and then leave a comment using an official Twitter account, but one that was still disconnected from ours, with clear information on it about why they were being contacted, saying, we see that you've shared this hyperlink, would you be interested? And then we direct them to the interview information and ask if they'd like to join. And the second was that through our interview contacts, asking if outlets would share the interview invitation on their channels. And only one of those took that up, and that was the Squawk Box after several requests. So we managed to get a bunch of people through that. Now, this is very, I wouldn't say this is necessarily methodologically rigorous in the sense that we have no way of guaranteeing an equal distribution of respondents because we simply don't know how to access them because they're not a defined category in any kind of market research repository of people, survey respondents, YouGov, whatever you want to use. They're just not there, right? So you can't access them in the same way that you could go and look for Labour voters using YouGov and so on. So that was tricky. So it wasn't easy is the answer to the ease question. It's not easy at all. And we're kind of experimenting here. There might be a methods paper out of this, which would be quite useful in terms of how we locate very hard to find people. So we will continue, I think, using the strategies to conduct interviews using social media and through our interview contacts, although we found that we might have reached the limits of that. We wanted 100 interviews and we got 20. So what we're now hoping to do with the survey is we're using a company called Prolific, which is just like a kind of market research consultancy company, basically, like Qualtrics and some of the others. So we're paying them to do two studies. We're first of all going to do a pre-screening study where we basically ask them, do you use this material? Like, do you use this content? And we're going to try and create some kind of scatter graphs where we can cluster different users. So, for example, we might have people that high consumers of alternative media, because what we got is all of the outlets on a kind of multiple choice thing. And if they say yes, I use this a lot, their answer is 3 or 2 or 1 or 0. And if they get a high score based on all of those, we can say that they're a higher user of alternative media and they'd be higher up the y-axis, right? And then we would do the same on the x-axis. We'd have their mainstream media consumption using a similar kind of measure. So what we hypothesize is we'll have a cluster of people that are in the low category, right? So they don't use much alternative media, they don't use much mainstream media, and then we'll have long tails that kind of go up either side, where people use a lot of mainstream media but not a lot of alternative media, and then use a lot of alternative media and not a lot of mainstream media. So we can kind of use that as a way to identify different sets of users, which then in a second wave survey will then contact and ask more specific information to try and get more information from them and invite them to interviews. So we're putting a lot of hopes on this survey. If we don't have much success with the survey, then the finding will probably be that it's very hard to find these people, and maybe that also that it would probably support what the digital news report found, which is that there's a very small percentage of people consuming this media. We don't know yet, but we will find out from the survey. Hopefully we'll have at least some idea of where these people, where these users are. The fact that it wasn't too difficult to find their hyperlinks on Twitter gives us a little bit of hope. But in terms of the left-right split, to finish the question, it's very unlikely that we're going to have a even sample of interviewees from these outlets, and especially from right-wing outlets. Because for the right-wing outlets that we have, Breitbart, Westminster, and what was the other one? Just those two, for example, their social media footprint is very small. They don't have a very big social media footprint. Their Facebook is, tiny. Conservative Women, another one. So you can't actually even find them on social media for the right-wing outlets. So it's one of those, really. And that's a kind of consistent issue in our study overall, actually, is that access to right-wing data has been very difficult. We only got 2 interviews from Breitbart. Guido said no. Conservative Woman didn't even reply. And Westminster, again, we had a contact to contact the guy who runs it, but he, again, was just non-compliant. So we have a very small sample of right-wing interviewees, simply because they didn't want to talk to us, effectively. I hope that answers the questions.
Yes, thank you very much, and good luck.
Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. And I would echo what Maria said. There's definitely a methods paper here. I mean, the way you're talking about it as well. I mean, there's a lot that I think people would gain from that, particularly having to recalibrate for COVID and the way you've had to go and trace things. I mean, it's really, really impressive that you're getting such figures as well. And the survey, I think, will generate a lot of results too.
We hope so, yeah.
So any other questions? Yes, there's a question in the chat, so I can read that from Scott. Thanks, Scott. And David as well. So hang on. David's got a very long question I could read. Busy household right now, apologies. We're all been there. I wonder to what extent they use mainstream media as sources for their own journalism, even as they criticise the same media for bias. And the comment in one of your interviews about mainstream media reliance on advertising got me thinking about whether these outlets ever lean on academic research or ideas to substantiate their positions. For example, the propaganda model, Loughborough election research.
Yeah, and that's another great question. So actually, I was looking at the source data today, and one of our hypotheses at the start of when we were looking at the sources, one of the hypotheses we had was that they do kind of cannibalize or use a lot of mainstream media at the same time as criticizing them, and they do. That's one of the key things that we found in our research, was that left-wing outlets, they use an awful lot of Guardian and BBC content as their sourcing for stories, and on right-wing outlets, you tend to see the Telegraph used a lot alongside. Actually, the Guardian again. There's just so much that happens here. So there's some contradictory elements where they'll criticise the BBC in an article, but also use the BBC to back up one of their arguments or assertions, because it's simultaneously seen as a trustworthy and reliable source of information, but also as something that's impartial. I think there's a fair distinction to be made there, that the information that the BBC has got is accurate. That can exist alongside a perception that the BBC is not impartial. And I think that can be, there's not necessarily a contradiction there. What also happens is that they take this content and reframe it, and that's something that's explicitly said in interviews. So in the 2 Breitbart interviews that I did, 2 separate individuals that both wanted to stay off the record and so weren't identified to each other or anything like that. Both of them said that one of their tasks was to find whatever was said in the Daily News, whether it was the Guardian, Telegraph, whatever, and then reframe it according to Breitbart's editorial line, effectively. So to basically, one person literally said we would change the adjectives and add a bit more information, right? So that's another kind of dynamic that's going on there, in terms of how, and the left-wing outlets will do this too. So they'll take something like, I was interviewing someone at the Canary about an article they'd written where they'd criticised the BBC, and they would say, yeah, what we'll do is we'll look for something before our morning stand-up, will say, the BBC's done this, how can we criticise this, right? And they'll take the kind of content, link to the content and say this is why this content is wrong, for example. But simultaneously, it's also used from an editorial perspective. The Canary likes to hyperlink everything because they think it's. They say to me, it's good editorial practice that they're because they fact check everything and all the rest, and therefore they use mainstream media as a good source of information. So if you want to talk about information ecology and disinformation and everything, you'll actually, if you don't think the BBC and the Guardian are spreading disinformation, then by kind of extension of that argument, you can make the case that alternative media outlets aren't either, because they're taking the information originally from good sources. We also looked into how much original content they produce, and again we found variations in that. As you'd expect, something like Guido Fawkes produces quite a lot of original content because it has reporters in Westminster looking for this stuff. And as a trend, as a lot of these outlets professionalise, they're looking to produce more original content through original reporters. So it's something they're less reliant on mainstream media, if you like, as kind of contents, as sources of their own journalism. But that's a fantastic question. One of our central hypotheses, actually, and points. And then the point about advertising. You can actually ask me about advertising. We're asking about the leaning on academic research. I can actually probably find an example from the Score Box where they specifically mentioned the Loughborough election research. I'm sure I've seen that. So the answer to that, probably anecdotally, because I haven't specifically looked at that in the data, would be yes. They would use academic research to back up. Often, I think a lot of the time, using academic research to back up what they're saying, but their opinions about the mainstream media, but also using academic research in many cases to back up their economic arguments as well. I've seen that used a few times. And Chomsky's propaganda model is a consistent theme in interviews. It's actually one of the really interesting things is a couple of people bring up the exchange between Noam Chomsky and Andrew Marr many, many years ago. It's on YouTube. If you Google Andrew Marr and Chomsky, they kind of use it as a touchstone for what they do, basically, and how they see the mainstream media. So, yeah, Chomsky is a very consistent leitmotif, if you like, in their content. So, yeah, great questions. Really central to what we're looking at.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Declan. We've got another one from Scott. Would you say audiences are hyper-partisans trapped in alt media echo chambers or filter bubbles?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. It's a good one. So, I think the overall evidence is, and I know Scott's working on this for his PhD work. As I understand it, and Scott would know better than me actually, the overall evidence as I understand at the moment, is that filter bubbles and echo chambers aren't necessarily a factor in the mainstream media, and actually you do get some crossover in the mainstream media. For alternative media, it's not. I don't think we have any specific variables or anything that could answer that question, except it would be qualitative data from interviews probably. And actually, the survey would tell us this, because it would tell us how often, whether they're disengaged with the mainstream media or not, and whether they only consume one type of alternative media. So hopefully the survey can answer this question to a degree. My sense of that, though, would be I think some people might be. I think there would be a minority. I think the majority are probably crossing over between mainstream and alternative media. Interestingly, if you read the Labour Party's, one of the Labour Party's post-election reports, they specifically criticise alternative media like Navarra and others for creating left-wing bubbles, filter bubbles, or silos. They use the term silos. They say that people, for example, Navarra or the Canary or whatever, were responsible for, during the election, creating a kind of inward-facing filter bubble silo around Corbyn. But they don't really back that up with any particular information, data. So again, hard to say. But hopefully, yeah, it's a great question. I haven't thought about it yet, and I will think about that in the survey now. Whether the survey tells us about whether they're trapped in echo chambers or filter bubbles.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Declan. Tom, you've got your hand up. Over to you.
Thanks, Paul, and hi, Declan. Thank you very much for a fantastic talk, and the project really seems excellent and very full-bodied, and obviously brings up so many issues that all of us are interested in. I wanted to go back a bit to a point that both Paul and Rosalind raised around the question of funding with these websites. Because my impression is certainly that all of these websites are, as they would describe it, independently funded, some of them either by advertising or others by sort of forms of subscription or reader patronage. I was wondering if you'd found within speaking to the sort of owners and runners of these websites, if there were different perceptions amongst them of whether their funding models gave them different, better, worse, more mighty, more hoity relationships with their readers compared to what I imagine they would call either government-funded media or corporate-funded media.
Yeah, great question again, and again a really central part of our study, because we're really interested in the organisational features of these outlets. In a nutshell, subscription is the way forward for these outlets, both my opinion and theirs, and in practice as well. So there are a couple of articles written about the original funding model that a lot of these outlets pursued, which was a kind of advertising-based, pay as you go viral kind of model. I'm not using the correct term there, and they wouldn't like me using that term. But basically, based on eyeballs, clicks, writers would get paid a percentage based on how well the article did. Having interviewed some people who've left outlets, that was quite an unpopular model among some writers. And some writers knew how the system worked very well, but it wasn't sustainable in the long run. Just like digital advertising revenue probably isn't sustainable in the long run for journalism as a whole, because a lot of the more well-placed mainstream outlets, say like the Spectator, for example, are in a good position because they've moved to subscription. The New York Times is a classic example, The Guardian, right? So just like in the mainstream, how subscription models are going to probably be the future for the most part, it's the same thing with alternative media, and they do talk about it a lot. So an outlet like Novara, for example, they told me their official number off the record, but I can tell you it's quite healthy for their subscription. It's enough to sustain the outlet for the time being and to pay people part-time. Similarly for the Canary, they say on the record and on their website that 95% of their revenue now comes from subscription, and that's enough to pay their staff 2 or 3 days a week. So a lot of their staff work on a part-time basis 2 or 3 days a week on a salary. For some outlets, I think that it's not so successful. I think Evolve Politics might be struggling with this kind of transition to subscription, although I wouldn't have that from them. And then on the flip side, some outlets are still doing very well with an advertising model. So Guido Fawkes does very well at advertising, partly because Paul Staines owns a political advertising company and advertises on Guido Fawkes and makes money through that. So I think there are exceptions, and of course in the mainstream there are exceptions where advertising works well as a model too, especially if you can own the proprietary means to it. But I think in general subscription is the way forward, and for some outlets it's not even relevant. So for Another Angry Voice, for example, it's not a relevant factor because they have no overheads. Another Angry Voice is a WordPress, a Facebook page, and that's it. So, and similarly for Squawkbox, so they actually don't need any money because they don't need it. They just don't need it to sustain the outlet because there's one person doing it on the side, if you like. So yeah, there's a multitude of different economic factors affecting these outlets. I think for the more serious-minded ones, or maybe serious-minded isn't fair, but ones that are aiming to professionalise, like Novara Media, subscription and Canary, subscription seems to be the way forward for them. Hopefully that answers the question. Let me know if I missed anything.
My point was that it's interesting that they are all slowly funneling towards subscription, whereas they would have originally had, some of them would have said we are reader funded, or, we take donations, and others are based around advertising. Yeah. But I wonder really whether their models of funding play into the different political outlets they give, in the sense that I've known that Guido Fawkes often speaks of, we are funded by the market because advertisers pay to see our readers, and the more readers we get, the more money we get from advertising. Whereas others like Byline are obviously very heavy on, we get donations for high quality journalism. Yeah. So I wondered if you've just seen anything in that sense of different perspectives on how their funding feeds into their particular journalistic outlook.
Yeah,
and I'll try and put myself properly this time.
Yeah, that's a great question as well. So I think for to be reader funded is a really kind of prestigious thing for a lot of these outlets, because they can really claim to being independent in that sense, because they're not, and they have to make the claim, we're not having to adhere to the line of any owner or investor or anything like that, and they use that as a way to juxtaposition themselves with the mainstream. Difficult to say with Guido because obviously Paul Staines didn't want to talk to us. We asked him many times because he replied, but he didn't want to do the interview because he didn't want to be compared to the other outlets. But from interviews he's done elsewhere, and there's quite a lot of material you can find from the Press Gazette and stuff like that. I think to summarise his outlook, it would be don't give a shit. Pretty much would be to put it in his kind of terms, because they're just happy to make the money. And do what they do. At one point I saw that they had an advertisement for pro-Brexit campaign, anti-Brexit campaign on their website, and we tweeted him about it, and he was like, I don't care, put some wine in the cellar, basically. So yeah, a very kind of market-driven, laissez-faire approach to that from Guido, which is kind of in keeping with the brand, really. So yeah. That would be that way of looking at it. I think a lot of them were quite relieved to be able to move off of advertising as a model, because it didn't make them so reliant, I think, on social media and Facebook and stuff for their economic success. And if they can have subscribers and they can have them in their own ecosystem, which is quite a healthy thing for them, I think, at least from their perspective. Yeah, I'm asking for that one.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Oh, Ros, go ahead.
Hiya. I guess I'm kind of thinking about maybe the flip side a little bit of what Scott said. And, thinking about like what you were saying about this maybe bit of a pipeline now between these outlets and the mainstream media. So with Harry Cole going to The Sun, and, you often see people like Ash Sarkar on even like Question Time, so like really mainstream kind of programmes on the BBC and stuff. So I was thinking whether any of them spoke about, maybe kind of broadening opinions and kind of views that, very kind of traditional audiences might be exposed to, and whether they see that as kind of part of their, mission or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Do you mean that the outlets are kind of presenting like a broader frame of point of view because they think
so like going on the BBC, and because I guess I'm kind of thinking what the point you made as well about disgruntled Guardian readers. I suppose before outlets like Novara, that might have been the most left-wing view you saw would have been like Polly Toynbee or whatever. Whereas that might not be the case, and whether they specifically actually try to do that as part of their, the kind of things that they do, exposure and stuff like that.
So it's that's a really great question as well. So there's a couple of dynamics there. Firstly, some of them do see going on the mainstream media as an opportunity to broaden their audience, that's for sure, because they're very much aware of the fact that they can get more attention that way. So the quintessential example would be Ash Sarkar going on Good Morning Britain and shouting, "I'm a communist, you idiot," and that's got like 4 million views on YouTube, right? And all of the students, when I teach them this course, I teach them this, do the week on this at Cardiff, they all recognise that moment, right? So that gives them brand recognition. I think a lot of this relates to Novara Media in particular, because I think that the personas related, the people related to Novara Media they're probably a bit more prominent sometimes than Novara. And actually having done interviews with a lot of their teams is a kind of almost a point of contention, because they're kind of afraid that someone like Aaron, not afraid, but they get the sense sometimes that Aaron Bastani is seen as Novara or Ash Sarkar is seen as Novara, and actually there's like a team of like 18 people. So trying to stay on topic. So the way that they see going on mainstream media is yes, one sense they see it as kind of more exposure. Secondly, however, from speaking to them, there is a sense in which they are pigeonholed by producers on mainstream media shows. So they'll kind of be like, Novara Media talked about this a lot. They saw that they were kind of seen as spokespersons for Corbyn, Novara, and would be brought onto shows to speak for the Corbyn position, right? And actually, in retrospect, 2 years down the line, when I interviewed them, they actually felt very uncomfortable about that, because they didn't want to be tied to an electoral project. That's not really what they want to do. And now, with the dust settled on the Corbyn project and the election in 2019, they kind of do, like you suggest, they do see themselves as broadening out a little bit their content. And they often talk about the ideological diversity within their outlet. So Michael Walker, who's one of their presenters, he's classed himself as a social democrat, right? Whereas Ash Sarkar, class war social democrat. whereas Ash Sakar would call herself a communist, right? And there's a different points of view there going on. James Butler is another really interesting person. He heads up their audio. I interviewed him, and he talked again about this kind of internal creative tension that they have in terms of they often use it as a way to broaden their audience. And then some of the other outlets, let's say like the Canary, Carrie Mendoza will sometimes appear on mainstream media. And a sense I get, because I haven't interviewed Carrie Ann, I've interviewed Nancy Mendoza, who's the head chief of operations. I think the sense that I get from that is that they don't like to shift to the media logics of mainstream media at all. They will just kind of come on and be as they are and not make any kind of accommodation to the media format of mainstream media talk shows, for example. So Carrie Mendoza has been on Newsnight, she's been on Question Time. Whereas people like Ash Sakar, you'll see them going on Have I Got News For You and joining with all the jokes and everything, and play to the media format because there's an instrumental function in doing that for Novara. That is also interestingly a point of tension, because I've seen some tweets online where Carrie Mendoza is kind of critical of people in Novara because they think that they're kind of playing to that mainstream too much, and they're pretending to be part of the kind of alternative scene. And then Novara have asked them about that, and they kind of said that there are sort of some tensions there in terms of how they place themselves and how they broaden their audience through a broader range of content. But there's a lot of experimentation going on too. So the Canary is currently experimenting with investigative reporting, a bit like Byline Times is doing. And Novara, they're experimenting with feature-length reports. So like Amber Steinley went to Bournemouth and High Street and did like a feature that wouldn't look out of place on Newsnight. So it's a very febrile, exciting area. I think if you're looking closely, you can see a lot of different experimentation with media logics and formats and coverage going on. In that sense, it's also a really interesting place to look if you want to understand the media system as a whole. And so the answer basically to the question would be that some outlets do want to use the mainstream media and appearances on the mainstream media as a way to broaden their coverage, and some are completely against the idea because it would be seen as kind of media capture or as a way of kind of bowing to the power of the mainstream, I think. Some like Guido, they kind of coexist because there's no real tension in Tom Harwood when he was there going on Sky, and now Tom Harwood's gone to GB News, and there's no real tension there because Guido kind of knows where it sits in the media system, is very comfortable with that position.
Cool, thank you.
What kind of wider media system would people at these outlets like to see, do you think? In a sense, they have a considerable dependence on the media system as it currently exists, as sources, as ways of getting further exposure, etc., but also typically exists fundamentally in opposition to the media as it exists. So it would be interesting if they ever express any ideas about what kind of media system there ought to be and how that vision might be attained. Really good point.
Yeah, great one. Actually, a lot of this kind of relates back to Tom's talk last month, like public service media and everything else. So a lot of their sentiment around this is aimed at the BBC, because obviously the BBC is such a huge organisation, so dominant in the media system that naturally their opinions and thoughts are drawn towards the BBC. When it comes to tabloids, I don't think they care too much. Audiences as well, because tabloids are kind of just seen as a fact of life. They are what they are, they know what they are, they're there, and they can't do too much about them. They're useful as a kind of way to bounce off and be antagonistic towards, I think, is something that they see. I don't ever anyone here say that they're out to get rid of any other news organisation or any other media organisation. I don't think I ever heard anyone in an interview say we're here to kind of take down the BBC, we're here to destroy the BBC, or we're here to destroy the Daily Mail. I think they would like to have bigger audiences that can compete. I think that would probably be how they would like to see. They would like the media system to give them more of a share, so they'd like to be a bigger part of that. Left-wing outlets would like the media system as a whole to shift towards the left and to take into account left-wing politics more, because they think that it's overwhelmingly biased against left-wing media. That's a common thread through Novara and Canary and Squawkbox and all others. Right-wing conservative bias at the BBC too. But a lot of them, I think a lot of them, when they kind of talk about normative values about what the media system should do and how it should be, they express a lot of stuff around public service broadcasting, right? They want an equitable system which is fair and balanced and which is in the interests of democratic norms, where people can be informed properly and given information and not be what they currently see as lied to or misinformed by the mainstream media. I think they would like to see the BBC have a much smaller share of the media system. That seems to be a theme, that it's unhealthy, they think, for the BBC to be so dominant. And that's something I heard from right-wing interviews too. They just think the BBC has too much power in the media system, and that the system should be more pluralism, is a term that popped up a lot. There should be more pluralism in the media system. So yes, there's a dependence, but you could also make that dependence argument at, most of the other news organisations. The BBC will pinch news stories from local journalism. The Daily Mail will pinch stories from the Times will pinch stories from the BBC, and vice versa. So that's that kind of interconnected dependence is probably something you see in the media system anyway. I don't think that's particularly. I think the only thing that makes that particularly important for alternative media is the fact that they don't also have a capacity, or have a smaller capacity to produce their own content. So while the Daily Mail will pinch stories and while the BBC will pinch stories, they also generate a huge amount of stories themselves. And I think that's the key difference, really. So I think they would like to see themselves producing more original content in certain ways. And that would shift, and that would in itself shift the way the media system works, because if alternative and independent outlets on the ground, close to the, further down the pyramid in terms of how the media system works, if they can produce good quality independent journalism that's fact-checked and reliable and quality and all the rest, that would actually change the way the media system works. So that's, again, something I think that they think should be there. Byline Times talk about this a lot. Byline Times are always talking about their idea of journalism being very close to sort of like Watergate, traditional campaigning, crusading, heroic age of journalism. And that's what they think journalism should do. Hold people to account and look for corruption and stuff like that. So there's lots of normative ideas bouncing around about how the media system should be. Some of them antagonistic, some of them positive, progressive. And I think probably in a nutshell, the antagonistic stuff is mostly aimed at the BBC. That would kind of match up with the fact that in the content, BBC is often criticised a lot. So yeah, going back to Tom's talk, some stuff there about the sentiment towards the BBC in particular.
Thanks, David. Really interesting point there, and thanks, Declan, for the response. And there's been a lot of synergies, I think, between this talk today and Tom's as well, which has been really great to see. And David's just put in the chat box, thanks for an interesting talk. Look forward to reading about it in due course. Well, I think we'd all echo that. I mean, you have some really fantastic data and more data to come. And I think the timeline of this project is going to get an awful lot of very interesting findings, particularly with what's happened in the UK media system for the past 18 months and 18 months to go. So I would definitely echo that. I'm sure you'll join me in thanking Declan for a really excellent talk. If we were in person, we'd probably clap, so I will probably do this pathetically on camera now. But thank you for your great talk and a fantastic project.
And thank you, everyone, for asking questions. Really appreciated it.